They labeled my seat family Maid and laughed when I saw it. That was the moment I realized I wasn't part of this. Family, not really. I was the help, the joke, the one who cooked the meal, but never got a real seat at the table. And as my mother-in-law smiled like she hadn't just humiliated me in front of everyone, I knew something had to change. I didn't know it yet, but justice was already on its way, wearing a suit and holding a legal notice. Let me take you back to the moment it happened. The house was buzzing with that fake holiday cheer. Soft jazz playing in the background, the scent of turkey and nutmeg hanging in the air, but beneath all of it, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, that pressure that always came with being around Cynthia, my mother-in-law. I walked in holding 2 freshly baked pecan pies, still warm through the foil. My hands were starting to shake, but I told myself it was just the cold outside, or maybe the nerves. I never showed up. Empty-handed, never had I cooked half the dishes on that table, but none of that mattered. My eyes locked on the chair at the end of the long, perfectly decorated table. It was my usual seat close to the kitchen where I could easily jump up when someone needed something, but this time it had been decorated. A satin ribbon was tied to the back, and taped to the front of the seat was a handwritten sign, thick black marker, big block letters, family Maid. I froze for a second. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it wasn't meant for me. Maybe it was some kind of joke, some weird Thanksgiving prank. But then Cynthia's voice cut through the room. "Oh, Rachel," she called out, fake surprise coding every word. "Look, we saved your seat, don't worry. You'll still be serving just like always." She laughed, tossing her head back like she'd said the funniest thing in the world, and they followed her sister. Barbara gave a dramatic eye roll and chuckle. Moraine, the other sister, smiled politely without saying anything. Even Mark, my husband, looked up from his phone and smirked. Before quickly looking away, I just stood there, pies trembling in my hands, my face burned, not from anger, at least not at first. It was shame, embarrassment, that deep, quiet humiliation that creeps up your spine and leaves you speechless. Forced a smile, or maybe it was a twitch. I don't even know. My whole body felt locked in place. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Inside, I was screaming, why would they do this? Why would he let them? I looked at Mark again. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Was pretending to scroll through his phone, pretending he didn't see, pretending he wasn't letting his mother humiliate me again. I swallowed the lump in my throat and slowly walked toward the table. My legs felt weak. The warmth from the pies in my arms had started to sting, but I welcomed it. It reminded me I was still standing. I set them down carefully on the sideboard and turned back toward the table. That's when I felt it, a buzz in my pocket. 3 short vibrations. A text. I slipped my phone out. Slowly, heart still hammering, my eyes flicked to the screen. It was from Noah, my son, 24. My anchor. He'd promised me he'd stop by later that afternoon, but this message only said 3 words were coming in. My breath caught. I didn't know what he meant, but in that moment I knew something was about to change. Earlier that day, I had told myself I could handle it, just one more Thanksgiving. I'd said that every year like a mantra. A survival tactic. I woke up at 5:30 that morning like I always did on holidays, slipped out of bed quietly so I wouldn't wake Mark, not that he would have noticed. If I stayed or left, he'd already mentally checked out days ago, probably buried in work emails or fantasy football stats. The kitchen was cold. Wrapped my robe tighter and started prepping the stuffing, my grandmother's recipe, the one I taught myself to make from memory after she passed. The smell of sautéed onions and sage filled the air. It should have been comforting, but I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest, that low, anxious thrum that always came around Cynthia. I kept glancing at the clock. I had 2 hours to get the pies done, get Noah's favorite cranberry compote chilled, and make sure Mark had ironed his shirt, because of course he wouldn't think to do it himself. As I worked, I could feel my shoulders tightening. My jaw ached from clenching. I told myself this time would be different. Maybe Cynthia would be decent. Maybe Barbara wouldn't make one of her passive-aggressive jokes. Maybe anyone would acknowledge the hours I poured into this meal, but I knew better. Mark finally wandered into the kitchen around 9, yawning, shirtless, scratching the back of his head like a sitcom husband. "Smells good," he mumbled, grabbing a slice of bread straight from the counter. "You almost done, almost?" I said, trying to keep my tone even. "Just have to get these pies." And he kissed my cheek, absent-minded, distracted, then disappeared down the hall. No offer to help, no thanks, just silence. The silence that had become our language over the last few years. As I rolled out the pie crust, my hands moved automatically, but my mind drifted to Noah. He'd called me 3 nights ago, said, "Mom, you don't have to go this year. You know you don't owe them anything." Had laughed it off, told him I'd be fine, that I didn't want to cause drama, that keeping the peace was more important. But Noah had gone quiet. Then he said something that stuck with me. "Peace isn't peace if it costs you your dignity." I didn't say anything back then, but it hit me hard, because deep down I knew he was right. I'd confuse silence with strength, tolerance with grace, but every year I chipped away a little more of myself, just to sit at their table after the food was packed up and the car was loaded. I stood in the driveway for a full minute before getting in. My hands were cold on the steering wheel. My stomach was in knots. I was scared not of Cynthia, not really, but of the truth I'd been pushing down for so long that maybe I wasn't welcome, that maybe I never had been. The ride over was quiet. Mark sat beside me texting the whole time. I watched the world blur past the window. Dead leaves skipping across the road. Gray clouds hanging low like the sky itself was holding its breath. By the time we pulled up to Cynthia's house, I had already rehearsed my smile already. Reminded myself to be helpful, pleasant, invisible like always. What I didn't know was that Cynthia had plans of her own, and that this year she wasn't just going to ignore me, she was going to humiliate me, and yet somehow even she wasn't ready for what was coming next. I wish I could say I was surprised, but when I walked into that dining room and saw the sign, "Family Maid," taped to the back of my chair, part of me just sank. The pies I was carrying were still warm, but my fingers went cold. My chest tightened, like someone had tied a rope around it and pulled. I stood there rooted to the floor, hoping, begging that it wasn't meant for me, but Cynthia made sure there was no confusion. She spotted me, eyes gleaming like she'd been waiting for this moment. Her red lipstick stretched into a grin. "Oh, Rachel," she called out, "we saved your usual seat." Then she added, with a wink loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't worry, you'll still be serving." Just like always, the room erupted into laughter, but it wasn't the kind that makes you feel included. It was sharp, pointed like knives disguised as smiles. Barbara snorted, covering her mouth with a napkin. Marlene gave one of those polite little chuckles and immediately looked away like she couldn't quite bring herself to meet my eyes. And Mark, he glanced at the chair, at the sign, at me, and then turned back to his phone. He didn't say a word. I stood there with both pies still in my hands, my face burning, trying to smile through it, but I physically couldn't. My throat felt raw. My jaw was clenched so tightly, it was starting to ache. I could feel my eyes stinging, that awful sensation when, tears are close, but you won't let them fall, not in front of them, not again. I told myself to move, just walk to the kitchen, set the pies down, act like it didn't bother me, but my legs were like cement. My mind was screaming, why did they do this to me every year? But I already knew the answer, because I let them. Because I showed up early and stayed late, because I cooked and cleaned and smiled while they dismissed me like background noise. Because I never stood up for myself, not really, and because Mark never did either. They didn't respect me because no one had ever made them, and now they had reduced me to a label, a joke, a punchline, taped to a chair. "Come on, it's just a bit of fun," Cynthia said, her voice sugary and fake. "You know how much we appreciate you." My gaze flicked to her, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I studied her, really studied her, the perfectly ironed blouse, the pearls, the smug tilt of her chin, and I realized something. She didn't see me as family. She never had. I was convenient, useful, manageable, but not equal. I turned slowly and carried the pies to the kitchen, my arms stiff. I didn't hear much of what was said behind me, just a few lingering chuckles, a chair scraping glasses, clinking. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else anyway. I set the pies down, leaned against the counter, and stared out the kitchen window. The backyard was still, and gray bare branches trembled in the wind, and for a second felt completely hollow. Then my phone buzzed. Again, I pulled it from my pocket, half expecting a spam message. Maybe Noah, saying he was running late, but it wasn't that. "Be there in 10. My hands trembled as I read it, my breath caught in my throat. He was coming, and he wasn't coming alone. For the first time all day, I felt something cracked through the fog of shame and anger that had wrapped itself around me. Hope. I stared at that text like it was a lifeline. "Be there in 10 minutes. That's all I had to hold it together. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, straightened my spine, and took a long, steady breath. I still felt like my skin was on fire and my chest was caving in, but beneath all that, something inside me had started to shift. A quiet voice, not loud, not angry, just done. I walked back into the dining room. Everyone was already seated. The Family Maid sign was still hanging on the back of my chair, like a proud little trophy I reached for. It slowly, calmly let me take that down, Cynthia said sweetly, halfway rising from her seat, pretending to be helpful now that the joke had landed. "No need," I said. My voice was steady, stronger than I felt. I folded the sign in half and placed it gently on the sideboard. She watched me, her smile faltering just slightly, like she wasn't sure what game I was playing anymore. I sat in the chair, the one they'd labeled for me, not because I accepted it, but because it was mine, because I was reclaiming it. I could feel their eyes flick toward me, sensing the shift, but not understanding it. I smiled, softly, said nothing. Mark was still scrolling on his phone, oblivious or pretending to be. He finally looked up. When I reached for my water glass, "You okay?" he asked quietly, almost cautiously. I met his eyes. "I'm fine." He gave a small nod clearly, relieved I wasn't about to make a scene. He never did well with discomfort or confrontation or me having a voice, but I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to finish what I'd started. You see, a few nights before Thanksgiving, I had finally told Noah everything. We were on the phone catching up, and something in me just broke. I told him about the years of sned comments, the backhanded compliments, the invisible labor that never got noticed but was always expected. I told him about last year, how Cynthia had told me there wasn't enough room at the table and had me eat at this counter while everyone else toasted pumpkin pie. There was a long pause, and then Noah said, "You know this isn't normal, right? I've gotten used to it." I told him, "Mom, that doesn't mean you should have to." His voice had gone quiet, measured, but I knew that tone. That was his "something is about to happen" tone. He told me he'd been interning at a law firm, small but passionate about helping women fight back against long-term domestic emotional abuse. He said his mentor, David, had worked cases where women like me, women who weren't beaten or bruised but erased, finally said enough. I remember laughing at first. What would I even do? Sue them for being mean? He didn't laugh. But we can serve them a notice. Boundary, eh? Warning, that word stayed with me. Boundary, because that's what I'd been missing all these years. Not love, not effort, not even respect. Boundaries. So we talked and we planned. David helped me draft something. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a formal see and desist, a legal notice, establishing boundaries. Expectations for my time, emotional labor, and unpaid contributions, a way to legally and emotionally reclaim my worth. And now they were almost here. The clinking of silverware, the forced laughter, the wine, pouring, it all became background noise. Just sat there in the chair they'd mocked me with and waited, not with fear, but with something else, power. The knock on the door was quiet, but it felt like thunder. For a second, no one moved. Cynthia paused, mid-sentence, holding a gravy boat like it was suddenly too heavy. Barbara's laugh trailed off. Uncertain, Mark looked toward the hallway, brows furrowed. I didn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest, but the rest of me was still focused. The second knock came sharper. "This time I'll get it," I said, standing up. Mark blinked. "You don't have to," but I was already walking. Each step down that hallway felt like shedding skin, years of swallowing words, years of being the helper, the peacekeeper, the maid. Not anymore. I opened the door, and there they were. Noah, standing tall, sharp, in a dark jacket I didn't recognize. His jaw was set, but his eyes softened when he saw me. Right behind him stood David in a gray suit, holding a folder under his arm and wearing the kind of calm confidence that makes people instantly nervous. "Hi, Mom," Noah said. "Right on time," I whispered. I stepped aside to let them in. Cynthia was already standing at the edge of the hallway, hands on her hips, her smile frozen in place, like she wasn't sure whether to be polite or pissed. "Noah, what?" "A surprise," she said, voice syrupy sweet. "You didn't say you were bringing a guest." Noah gave a tight smile. "This is David. He's here on behalf of my mom." The room stilled. David nodded politely. "Good afternoon. We're here to deliver a formal notice regarding the misuse of personal labor, emotional distress, and the ongoing expectation of unpaid service." Cynthia blinked. "Excuse me?" Mark stood up. "Now what the hell is this?" I stepped forward. "It's not a lawsuit," I said calmly, meeting Cynthia's eyes. "It's a formal boundary, a cease and desist, outlining my role in this family, what I will and will not continue to do." Barbara scoffed. "You're kidding, right?" "No," David said smoothly, opening the folder and handing Cynthia the document. "This outlines her labor over the past decade. Cooking, cleaning, organizing holidays, managing logistics, all unpaid, all unacknowledged. It also states that she is no longer participating in family gatherings unless treated with basic dignity." Marlene finally spoke quietly. "Rachel, why didn't you say anything?" I turned to her. "I did, just not with lawyers before." Mark looked at me like I'd grown horns. "You brought legal action into Thanksgiving." "No," I said softly. "You did. The moment you sat there and watched them humiliate me again." Cynthia's face had gone pale. Her voice was shaking now. "It was a joke?" "No," I said, "it was a pattern." For the first time in years, the room was silent, not fake. Polite silence, real silence. Uneasy, heavy. I looked at the chair, the one with the sign still folded neatly on the sideboard, and I felt something lift off me, like I'd finally set something down I'd been carrying for far too long. Noah walked over and stood beside me, hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Cynthia held the papers like they were on fire. "You're tearing this family apart." I shook my head. I'm saving myself from it." And with that, I turned, walked past the table, and headed for the front door. David followed, calm and professional. Noah looked at me, waiting. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded once. "I've been ready for years." The drive home was silent, but it was the kind of silence that feels peaceful, not heavy. Noah kept glancing over at me like he was trying to read my expression, trying to see if I was okay. I didn't say much. I was still processing, but I remember looking out the window and seeing the trees blur past, bare branches dancing in the wind, and thinking I'm never going back there. Again, not like that when we got to my house. He walked me to the door like I was fragile, like he thought I might fall apart the moment I was alone. I didn't. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea, took off my shoes, and sat down at the kitchen table, my own table, and I let myself feel everything, not just the humiliation, not just the anger, but the relief, the weight that had finally been lifted after years of holding my breath, the strange lightness that came from finally saying enough. The next day, I woke up late. I didn't clean up after anyone. I didn't fold anyone's laundry. I didn't cook for a crowd that would never thank me. I made myself pancakes just for me, and I ate them in bed. It's strange how good guilt can be at disguising itself as loyalty. For over a decade, I thought I was keeping peace by staying quiet. I thought I was being strong by enduring it all. I thought being a good wife meant keeping Mark's family happy at the cost of my own, but peace built on it. Silence isn't peace. It's self-eraser, and loyalty isn't about suffering in silence. Loyalty should be mutual, rooted in respect. Mark texted me that evening, just a short message that was unnecessary. I stared at it for a long time, then I deleted it without replying. We haven't really spoken since he moved into a hotel. A few days later, I didn't ask where or why. I didn't need to, I think. Deep down, I knew this had been coming, that we'd been quietly unraveling for years, that the moment I stopped playing the role he'd grown comfortable with, everything would shift, and honestly let it, because I'm not playing roles anymore. Noah has been checking in on me every few days. He even brought over dinner, though. Following weekend, he made lasagna, burned the edges, but it was perfect, he said. It's your turn to be taken care of. Couldn't even answer. I just hugged him and tried not to cry. I've also started volunteering at a local women's center, not because I have all the answers, but because I understand how easy it is to lose yourself, to become small, quiet, agreeable until you don't even recognize the woman in the mirror. But now I do. Now I look in the mirror and I see someone who finally chose herself, not in anger, not in revenge, but in truth and strength. Thanksgiving looks different now. No crowded tables, no fake smiles, no labels, just peace. Real peace. And every now and then when I think back to that chair, the one they labeled Family Maid, I smile because they were right about one thing. I did served meals. I served a love. I served patience and strength. But this year I served boundaries. I served self-worth. And I served just as cold, with a side of dignity. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, unappreciated, or erased in your own family or relationship, just know this: you're not alone and you deserve better. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is finally choose yourself. If you found this story moving or meaningful, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more real stories about strength, healing, and transformation. Until next time, stay grounded, stay brave, and never forget your worth.